Well, good morning. What a beautiful day in Kansas, isn't it? It's great to be alive. Well, good morning and welcome to the 138th Landon Lecture on Public Affairs. The Landon Lectures were started in 1966 by the late Governor Alf Landon and the late K-State President James McCain. The goal of the Landon Lectures is to bring the most prominent public figures to Kansas State University to discuss the pressing issues of the day. We are very pleased today to welcome Brian Williams to the Landon podium to join 137 predecessors in bringing his thoughts and opinions on important issues facing America and the world. Before introducing Brian Williams, I'd like to introduce other members of the platform party. On my left, Dr. Jackie Spears, Professor of Education and President of our wonderful Faculty Senate. Jackie? And next to him, the newly elected President of the Kansas State University student body, wonderful young man, Michael Burns, a junior in agricultural economics. Michael? On my right, Edward Seaton, chairman of the Landon Patrons and editor-in-chief and publisher of the Manhattan Mercury. Next to him, Dr. Charles Reagan, associate to the president and chairman of the Landon Lecture Series. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very, very honored and pleased to have the opportunity this morning to introduce Brian Williams, the new anchor of the NBC Nightly News. And Brian, as I was talking to you today, and as I've seen so many of your broadcasts over the years, let me just say this, you are off to a truly excellent start as the new anchor of NBC. Wouldn't you agree with that? And as Brian indicated, people say, oh, nobody's watching the evening news anymore. Yeah, like 30 million people a night are still watching the evening news, and many of them are tuned in to NBC. The truth is, the NBC Nightly News today is the best and most comprehensive national news broadcast in America today. Well, before succeeding Tom Brokaw, who is a legend in his own right, before he succeeded Tom in this position, he was the NBC News Chief White House correspondent from 1994 to 96 and was the anchor and managing editor of the Saturday edition of the NBC Nightly News for 6 years. In over 20 years of broadcasting, Brian Williams has reported from 23 overseas nations on countless stories of national and international importance. For example, he gave intensive live coverage of the September 11th attacks and their aftermath. In 1997, his continuous coverage of the death of Princess Diana was watched by countless millions in this country and throughout the world. Millions also watched his many hours of live coverage following the crash of the TWA Flight 800 and the death of John F. Kennedy, Jr. While serving as NBC News Chief White House correspondent, Brian Williams circled the world several times with President Clinton aboard Air Force One and covering every foreign and domestic trip by President Bill Clinton. On one of the most historic trips of the Clinton presidency, Brian was the only television news correspondent to accompany 3 U.S. presidents, Clinton, Bush, and Carter, to Yitzhak Rabin's funeral in Israel. Brian Williams has been awarded 3 Emmys. Prior to his broadcasting career, Mr. Williams worked in the White House during the Carter administration. Beginning as a White House intern, Brian attended George Washington University, Catholic University of America, and is the recipient of several honorary degrees. Over the years, we have seen many of the country's top journalists as Landon lecturers, beginning with Dan Rather, Charles Collingwood, Charles Kuralt, Leslie Stahl, Tom Brokaw, Bernard Shaw, Sam Donaldson, and as you recall, just 2 weeks ago, Jim Lehrer. Well, it's a great honor and privilege for me to welcome to the Landon podium the next rising star for television news in America and for NBC, ladies and gentlemen, Brian Williams.
Thank you very much. There's the water right there. Thank you very much, Mr. President, as they say, to the trustees and administration, to the student government, to the students, all members of the K-State community. Thank you for having me. I am so flattered and so humbled to be here. You look at the names of the lecturers that come before you, including all of my favorites as an American history buff, Beschloss, McCullough, Goodwin, 5 U.S. presidents, and it is very difficult to think of anything you could possibly add that hasn't been said and said 10 times better than you could have. So it's a bit limiting to any rookies who come to this podium. Very quickly, a great story from American history has to do with a building in Lower Manhattan called Fraunces Tavern. It's still there to this day. Things weren't going well in the early American Revolution, and an aging George Washington got up before a lot of the men who had served underneath him, and as if to give them a little jab, as he removed his glasses from his pocket, he said, "You'll forgive my use of spectacles, but years of service to my nation render them necessary." And they all looked at him, and the point was made. So that is to say, similarly, you'll forgive my use of spectacles, but years of service to my network have rendered them necessary. I must say about our dear president that he can keep a secret. He can keep a confidence, and here's why I say that. The first very kind invitation that went out to me to stand behind this lectern was a few years back. I was an anchorman in cable. We had a primetime newscast, and the economy of scale in cable versus broadcast television being what it is, we didn't get that broad an audience. Not that many people ever knew we were on every night. If a tree falls in the woods, you get my drift. And I was so flattered at the invitation, but I said to him, really what I couldn't say out loud or on the record. I said, there's something I'm not quite allowed to share with you, but work with me here. I can strongly indicate to you today that if you're willing to wait a while, I will have a job with a title that may bring a few more people to the arena, if you understand. So, it was a Woodward and Bernstein moment. I was trying hard to lead him down this path and couldn't officially confirm or deny what I was trying to tell him. Had he ever slipped in the intervening years to the Mercury, we would have had one great story in Media Row. As many of you may know, it all started for me in Kansas. I had a classic, thoroughly middle-class upbringing out east. I grew up in a small town called Elmira, New York. I always have called it, since we started coloring everything in our lives, a red spot in a blue state. It was a town of about 14,000, and it was a great upbringing. I later kicked around. I had to start at my own local community college. I was a fireman for a few years in the state of New Jersey once we had moved from upstate New York to the shore of New Jersey. I got a case of Potomac fever and discovered Washington, D.C. I was lucky enough, as the president mentioned, to get an internship in the White House. My boss in the White House was Scott Burnett of Manhattan, Kansas. So I knew then this state was going to play a role in my professional, at least, upbringing. But I had always, in the back of my mind, had a goal. I had watched a lot of television news, and I had engaged in the act of journalism in my high school paper and my community college paper. I had always had this goal to work in television, and I was introduced to a man named Bill Bankston. Bill ran a station, KOAM. I knew the call letters stood for Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Missouri, so it gave me a pretty good idea where that was in the United States. One evening in Washington, D.C., I took Bill to dinner, and I just decided to beg, just throw myself at his mercy and ask for a job. I beat him down, I cracked his will, I broke his spirit. And Bill Bankston, having never seen me in front of a television camera, hired me that night. And I couldn't wait to rush home and get out the Rand McNally and find out exactly where Pittsburg, Kansas was. Well, I found it right down there in the southeast corner, and never knowing that all those surrounding great towns like Chanute and Coffeyville bought a Ford Escort at Coffeyville Motors eventually. Independence and Parsons, and of course over on the Missouri side, it sure looked like Nevada on the map. I learned it was pronounced Nevada the minute I arrived. Down to the south, it sure looked like Miami, Oklahoma. Well, it's Miami when you get here. I rented a truck, and I threw my trusty Cocker Spaniel in the front seat, and I pointed my truck west from Washington, and I moved to Kansas to start a new life and a new career, having carefully followed the advice I now dispense to young people, and that is, if you're truly interested in a career in television, you've got to start at a place where you can do every job. It's really a universal truth in so many occupations. It's the best way, I think, to go about it. And I learned a lot as well about myself and my country. I always, of course, define myself as an American through and through, but the truth is I hadn't really lived in America until I had come out and moved to Kansas. The transmitter had cows grazing at the base of the tower. I found that your work week runs 7 days. And doesn't really stop, at least for rookies getting their start in television. And I found that the salary in Pittsburg, Kansas, well, I started at $168 a week, and by the time of my departure, I was up to $174, I don't mind admitting. I have never worked harder in my life. Fear is a great motivator. Half of my friends out east thought I had taken leave of my senses. I threw myself at my job. There was very little spare time, and luckily there was very little money to go with it. What little money and spare time I did have, I threw myself at a local research project trying to decide whether Chicken Annie's or Chicken Mary's was the best chicken in southeastern Kansas. Thank you. You meet some phonies in life, by the way, who pretend to be southeastern Kansans and just drop either Chicken Annie's or Chicken Mary's. You can't not have an opinion. You have to have a favorite. It was a lot, you're either, in New York, you're Mets or Yankees, and you have to have an opinion. Chicken Annie's or Chicken Mary's. I long ago took a vow of impartiality in journalism, so you're not going to get the truth out of me here today. I had a secret the whole time I worked in Kansas. Just as I had a secret when I was on the back step of a fire truck as a volunteer firefighter in New Jersey, just as sitting in my first college courses in that community college, I had a secret and I could share it with no one. Maybe a family member, but I could really share it with no one on the outside. From a young age, I wanted one of 3 jobs in the world. And the problem was they were all occupied by men named Rather, Jennings, and Brokaw. I just thought that if I worked hard enough, didn't tell anyone, but worked hard enough, maybe someday it could happen for me. It was outlandish, bordering on arrogant, but I figured that if it was possible anywhere, it was possible in the United States of America, and it was possible if you were willing to work hard for it. To this day, well-meaning people confuse where I'm from with where my career started. You'd be surprised at how many events like this one I'm introduced as being from Kansas. I hope it's okay with you that I've never corrected these people. It's a great place to be from. In going back through so many of the past lectures, it is an intimidating business. You've heard from some marvelous people, some of the great minds, politicians, thinkers, authors, the people I truly look up to. And a note for all of you who are reading this someday in pamphlet form. My aim here today is to have more of a conversation with the good folks who've joined us in the hall today and those watching by extension on video and those listening to streaming audio on the internet, on the website, as I know is available. I'd like to have more of a conversation, having come all this way from New York, and before I head back there, I will turn 46 years of age 2 days from now. And the following is for those of you my age or older. I want to talk about a phenomenon which, if I'm successful, will become a metaphor just moments from now. In that small town where I grew up, Elmira, New York, the houses were close together. We could easily tell what Mrs. Jenkins or Mrs. Miller were preparing for dinner. And more than that, there was this phenomenon, and I'm wondering for how many of you it's familiar. When the evening news was on, or when an important show was on, Ed Sullivan on Sunday nights, or in later years it was Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In Monday nights at 8 o'clock, where I grew up. A few people are nodding. You could tell because of the blue glow on the inside of the curtains or the shades that you were watching the same show, because there, during commercial breaks or station breaks or during a dip in the scene, the same light flicker in your house was happening in your neighbor's. And in the early days there, we only got the 2 networks on the rabbit ears on top of the set. I love seeing how many heads are nodding. And so you had very limited choices then. You know, Revolution, ABC came along. What are we going to do with these 3 networks and all this choice every night? Well, some of these shows, Americans just watched them. They watched them en masse by the millions, and there was agreement that during that time period on that night was what you watched. I mentioned shows like Ed Sullivan and Laugh-In. Many times, of course, we were all watching the same thing, and it was no laughing matter. First, the assassination of Martin Luther King, and then, of course, Robert F. Kennedy. We were in our own homes, but we were watching together. And we had that collective experience. And it wasn't just happening in homes that neighbored each other. You could drive across one of the massive bridges in New York and look over at an equally massive apartment complex and see those shots changing and the flickering at exactly the same time in all those apartment windows. And in a strange way, even though we're talking about television, it made us one. It gave us something we had in common with the stranger in apartment 13C or Mrs. Miller and Mrs. Jenkins next door to our house. You could go to work or school the next day and say simply, "Did you see that?" And people would know what you were talking about without further explanation. There was really nothing else on that night that you would be watching. My notion of boyhood has within it that notion of the blue glow, and these days it's more of a strobe light. About a year ago, I came home from work, and I noticed that on our television sets there were these new set-top boxes, the size of a microwave oven. They're enormous things, and my wife said that since we have the premium movie package on cable, these nice men from the cable company came and at no extra charge put these boxes on top of our televisions. In one case, the box is larger than the television it rests on. I learned since then that we have 600 digital channels in our house. I've only brought myself to go up into about the 400s. I believe one should pace yourself in life. I'm not quite sure what's up there. After 4:50, I can't vouch for it. Some of the channels have just music. There's no pictures being streamed over there at all. There's just music, and there's any kind of music you can imagine. But I don't know if or when you'll find me up there between 500 and 600. I may do it on a lark someday, if I'm homesick, perhaps. But I can't figure out if the arrival of all these channels coincided with someone asking for that amount of choice or if it just came. And I can't decide what it means about who we've become and where we're headed. We sure have given viewers choice in this country. Again, to recall whether it was preceded by demand, I don't quite remember. I think we were busy back then. We all operate on the assumption, after all, that more is better. So these days, it's possible for 600 employees of a 600-employee firm to come to work and have no shared experience of the night before. We will often in our newsroom ask young people and old, did you see, and we'll fill in the name of the show the last evening, and there won't be a glimmer of recognition. It turns out we were all watching something else. It's really a remarkable development, and it's happening really in all media, and it's a troubling development when you add in that nagging phrase, an informed electorate. Back in 1986, which now seems so long ago when you read it, a great man giving this very lecture said the following, quote, "Television news in contemporary American life helps define common points of interest," close quote. That sounds almost quaint today. Imagine saying that today. In 1986, of course, there was no internet, there was no email, no two-way pagers, cell phones. BlackBerries still only grew naturally, and you wouldn't think of putting one on your belt. The speaker was Tom Brokaw, and the world really was, 19 years ago, a different place. To paraphrase another Alf Landon lecturer, are we better off? The commercial during the Olympics, if you watched the Olympic Games as I did, this is a movie about my life made by me. Do you remember that woman's voice? The commercial must have aired 50 times. And in a way, there are many things that could be anthems for our society, and that was one of them. This is a movie about my life made by me. That may be where we are right now. Choice has meant customization. It's all about you in today's society. That's what the marketers tell us. How many commercials end with that tagline? And I like that because it's best for me. The Republic was founded on the notion, that nagging phrase about the informed electorate. And in that Republic these days, here is the grave danger. It is possible in this country to wake up every day, head off, and live your life and go to bed at night and see and hear only the media you already agree with. We're now able to avoid entirely any unpleasant thoughts or ideas, anything that will upset us. That's the whole basis of my news on so many different websites. If you find something repugnant, does it upset you? Do you find it the least bit challenging to just hear about it or have it linger in your mind during the day? Filter it out. It's okay. This is modern-day America. Over the past 5 days, we had 140 people killed in Iraq. It's an unpleasant place. I've been there. It's unsettling. Why not avoid that and on your website just make it so you'll get updates and alerts on the status of the potential criminal charges against the woman they call the runaway bride? Do you want to be a journalist? Do you want to proclaim yourself a journalist? You can form your own website or blog now. All you need is a laptop and a modem and an opinion. It helps to have a strong one because you'll get heard. You can write pretty much what you please, and your writing will appear right up there next to the great names in the news business, like the Wall Street Journal and and the New York Times and NBC News and the Mercury Online and ABC and CBS. Now, all of those organizations have spent millions to hire correspondents who know their beats, correspondents who've traveled the world, traveled to the nations they cover. They've probably been shot at in hostile fire. They've probably interviewed presidents and heads of state. They are trained to work by sets of ethical standards every day under the threat of libel. But all the words on the internet take the same weight. There's a great New Yorker cartoon. Two dogs are sitting around a computer, and one says to the other, "That's the great thing about the internet. No one knows you're a dog." I will allow those currently plying their trade on the internet to figure out who I'm referring to. So who are our heroes? And by the way, I am hoping for and expecting a robust question and answer period before you let me out of your clutches to go back to New York. I want you to let me have it. Who are our heroes today? I'm raising two teenagers. I ask this question in our house all the time. Are they authors? Any of them? Are they athletes? Are they politicians? Are they media figures? Have we lionized these media figures of our own creation? Think of the books that have made the bestseller list over the past few years. The one title that stands out to me is Self Matters. It may perversely be an anthem for our times as well. It's a real good thing self didn't matter as much back in 1941. We wouldn't have had people like Bob Dole and the other great men and women who marched out of Kansas and went off as far as they knew to save the world, and they were right. A great man called them the greatest generation, and he was right. They came home from that war, and if you haven't read this new autobiography of Senator Dole, I can't recommend it enough. In our culture of criticism, the senator was very upset recently. The Washington Post book reviewer, feeling he, I guess, had to criticize something about the book, accused Senator Dole of trying to hop on the bandwagon of the greatest generation and cash in on the trend. Bob Dole was the greatest generation. This greatest generation made sure we were all comfortable. We took the society they handed us. We formed what we have today, this massive economic engine, but we are marked by self-obsession, and it is such a troubling characteristic. We are fragmented. We're split politically. Turn on any media and you will hear that. We are media and celebrity driven. Anytime People outsells Time magazine, anytime the Super Bowl outranks the State of the Union address, how many Americans can name a single justice on the United States Supreme Court? And our age is marked by so much noise, so much chatter. So much of it is so coarse, and it's on all the time. And with so much of it, no one person can be heard above the din. No one idea can be heard above it. We go off in a corner and talk on our cell phones in a way we never would have before. Some people just brazen about sharing their conversation with everyone around them. Communications have become paramount, no matter who's listening or not. Lovers of history and those of a certain age will remember the name Joseph Nye Welch, and if you don't remember the name, you'll remember his quote, what he's famous for. He said to Joe McCarthy, as the witch hunt of the same name was starting to wane at a congressional hearing, "Have you no sense of decency?" At long last. Well, America listened. The nation stopped to consider the question this man had posed. It was a very dramatic moment, a key moment in American history. My sad theory goes that that moment wouldn't be possible today. It's not possible in our society because we may not be able to name anyone with that kind of moral authority. In a nation split 50-50, with turnout running at about 50%, no idea stands out or gets heard or breaks free of the other noise. Not above this kind of noise. This is deafening. And if it gets too much, we're all invited to turn on our personal iPod and hear only the music we want to hear. Nothing that's going to upset us or challenge us. Nothing foreign or strange or new to us. No risk of exposure to anything remotely unfamiliar or, again, God forbid, challenging. And about future challenges, our society of self, of great wealth and of great comfort mostly, this emphasis on the individual over the collective. Here I see the news as mixed, good and bad. First, the part of it that I'm a party to. Again, I have these two teenagers, and they are members of what I have dubbed the trophy generation. Have you seen what has happened with trophies? The average child entering their teens now has more trophies than the high school trophy case that I attended as a young boy. And I've figured this out. Here's why. The young parents of my generation wanted the very best for them, and we were going to distill all the mistakes we had made and make their way in the world better. So we wanted to spare them any disappointment at all in life as they came up. So field day, for example, a common day when the weather breaks at elementary schools across the country, where we used to get blue ribbons for first and red and white and so on. Field day now, everyone gets a ribbon, and at some of the wealthier schools, there are trophies for field day, for coming out and competing, for bringing a pulse to school that day with you. Because we've decided this will be a disappointment-free society when you're young and you're coming up. Because we've decided that finishing second or third can have absolutely devastating consequences for our young people. It can be stigmatizing, and you can just fall off the rail and be forever lost to society if you place third in field day. So we have set up this culture to celebrate our children, and they are told just by Barney alone, probably 50 times a day, how much they are loved. Now, in addition to how much they are hopefully told at home how much they are loved, and that was one job we took seriously. The ramification, what I'm seeing shake out is young people are coming into the workforce, and they are finding that it's not quite as set up as their middle school was to celebrate them. They are finding this society that, however harshly, is set up to reward those who finish first and punish those who finish last, to their great surprise and chagrin. And I watched this happen in our newsroom. The good news is that the legacy of the great man from Russell, Bob Dole, is safe. I have been over with our young men and women 2 trips now to Iraq and that theater, and I wish you could all see them all. You would be so impressed by them. They are so well trained. They are so motivated, and they love their country, and they don't ask why, and they don't hesitate, and they are working so hard in some of the worst conditions on the planet. It actually lifts me up to be around them when I come home having been with them. When I go to Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, Ward 57, where the amputees are cared for, and when all I hear from them is, "Doc, when can I get back with my unit?" They are starting to send back to Iraq the first amputees who have been fitted with new limbs because they will not take no for an answer. There's no other option to them. Of course they're going to go back and fight with their units. You would feel so good about our future. You would feel so good about this country if you could see what I have seen of these fighting men and women, and I think they deserve our applause today. There's more good news, and that is that while we have laid by the wayside, to my great chagrin, and in some cases neglected things that we led the world in, like trains, cars and space exploration. No one was better than the United States, and now we see where our challenges are. Where that has happened, we have also created great things. And think, my favorite phrase, oh, the places you'll go, that I feel explains what I do for a living. Think of where the internet can now take you within 2 and 4 seconds. Think of our great law libraries that are standing there in silent frustration at people's ability to access legal cases, answer any research question, however important or however trivial. The other day in our newsroom, we had a question. What was the case before the Supreme Court that had as its central holding the presumption of confidentiality of trash left at the curb? Justice William Brennan wrote the dissent in that case. What was it? That was the question. We had the answer in 7 seconds. It truly is at the speed of light. That truly will be one of the great achievements of our times. We will be asked by our grandchildren what it was like before email. Well, we're already being asked that. Before Google, all these great venerable names in our society. We have a new verb, to Google. I have a new competitor of all things called Google News. Who knew? I have to say that it all brings me back to Kansas and that secret dream that I would somehow occupy 1 out of 3 jobs on the planet. Again, all 3 jobs occupied by lions. I was the fortunate recipient of a departure from one of those jobs that was marked by absolute class and dignity and grace. Tom Brokaw left NBC Nightly News with his imprint on Society Safe. He had introduced a new phrase to the American lexicon, the greatest generation. Can you imagine having left that kind of a mark? And like the Olympic Games, on the next to last lap, Tom reached back with that baton, and there it was in front of me. Having filled in for him for 10 years, that was my moment, and there it was, and I grabbed it. And thanks to the hard work of the best team in television news, I didn't drop it. We didn't lose a stride. Had we, it would have been only my fault. But thanks to Tom Brokaw, this has worked out so well for NBC News. But the Lions are gone. Dan Rather is gone now. My friend Bob Schieffer is anchoring the CBS Evening News. I know our prayers today are with my friend Peter Jennings, who is starting his 2nd round of chemotherapy and is on my mind and in my prayers every day of my life. So the Lions are gone for now from my business, and now the obituary writers are coming around. And they're writing about what we do for a living, these so-called dinosaur newscasts that the big 3 evening networks put on starting at 6:30 Eastern Time. My friend Sam Donaldson gave a speech recently at a convention in Las Vegas during which he declared the evening newscast dead. Well, Sam, my friend, I'm here to tell you that every evening, upwards of 30 million Americans engage in an act, a very simple act that they've been doing at the same time for decades. And it's a very intimate choice. It's who are you going to have into your living room, in some cases, for dinner. And in those cases, I thank you very much, by the way. They turn on one of 3 evening newscasts that have been around for decades. And if you add up all the cable news channels, you can't come close to that number of viewers. Can't come close. If you add up the top 10 everyday large metropolitan newspapers, can't come close to that number. Doesn't work that way. You throw in some websites and blogs, you can't reach that number. Nothing can reach that number. After all these years, isn't it interesting that during these big 3 evening newscasts, we have something of a collective viewing experience? It makes us the #1 single source of news in the United States after all these years. Now, I don't pretend that when I drive through Manhattan, either this one or that other one they talk about out east, that I see that same blue glow. It doesn't happen like that anymore. As I say, it's more like a strobe light of about 600 choices, depending on where you live. But I do see a nation that is growing a little weary of that noise that we spoke of. Less than 7 hours from now, I will sit in a chair and look into Camera 1 in Studio 3A in New York. And I'll be looking for anything familiar out there in the America where I grew up, because my memories are so vivid. To complete the circle, I'd like to think that there are viewers here in Kansas who perhaps missed that blue glow, who are looking back at me and looking to me to complete something familiar, a glimmer of perhaps what we once had, and maybe a preview of what can be if we put our minds to it. For now, I'll thank you for having me, and I'll invite your questions.
Great job, man. Great job. Thank you. Terrific.
Well, let's mix it up.
You bet. So please, if you would go to your right over here or over here to your left to ask any questions that you would like to Brian Williams. And Brian, thank you for a marvelous Landon lecture presentation this morning. You know, as I was watching Brian take over for Tom Brokaw, I actually metaphorically thought of the baton handoff. And it was flawless and it was seamless. And Brian, you could not have done a better job and are doing a great job. And you didn't drop the baton here today either. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so please, you know, he wants questions now, so head over to your right or to your left, and I think we have one question over here right away. So, Brian.
Can you tell me why we hear so little on the evening news about the Congo, where people are dying at the rate of a tsunami every month, mostly from disease and starvation, and some from war, where Jan Egeland, speaking at the UN, described it as a tsunami every month, year in and year out for the past 6 years?
It's a valid question, and for every Congo, there are 10 to 12 other stories that we're not covering for mostly good reasons and probably some indefensible reasons. Here we are in the age of the genocide going on in Darfur. We've seen other genocides in our lifetime, and it's hard to believe. The leading reason is, and this is a bit of a chicken and egg proposition, look at what goes into our average newscast, which again, after the removal of commercials, leaves us for about 22 minutes. And during those 22 minutes, what it has to do is really mirror a major metropolitan daily newspaper. We were forced, the moment the first plane hit the first building, to change entirely how we covered our nation and our world. And to this day, so much of our newscast every night, as it will when I get back to New York tonight, has to deal with stories that got their start on that day. We have troops on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan. Often, stories like Congo mean that it is very difficult to get our people in there and guarantee our safety. As someone who has tried to cover the story in Iraq and encountered some, shall we say, sporty conditions there, I can tell you, when I was the eve of the election in Iraq, there I was with a cameraman who happens to be a father of four. We had our closest encounter. So I can tell you that I will, and it is early yet in my administration, I can tell you that part of my charge will be to get our cameras and the light they can shed to the Congo. I would not be against a kind of pooling of resources. If one news organization can get in there, sometimes you have to use NGOs or the local governments, and that can be very difficult. But the only thing worse than not covering these stories that are unfolding during our age is to look back a decade later and say, where were we then? Why did this happen on our watch? Yes, sir, did you have a question as well? Yes, sure.
Did you have a question? Take the mic there, would you please?
Since you went to Sumatra in Indonesia for the tsunami, how were people responding to the tsunami relief efforts that the U.S. sent? Like a lot of people. How are people responding over there?
Well, thank you for the question. It was it would take another lecture to just describe that trip, the 44 hours it took us to get to Banda Aceh. We made a decision after the tsunami to go to the hardest hit area, and if we didn't make it, we would have tried, and it was the noble course, but we made it in. And I don't know if, as long as I live, I will ever have the words or the ability to describe what we saw. The amount of death that we saw and what it will now mean to that society where everyone has lost someone, and some people have lost everyone in their families. The government, at first, while we were there, was caught off balance, of course, and it's a tricky situation in Banda Aceh. There was starting to be some resistance by the time we left. Not all the flights were allowed in. Flights that wanted to come in, we found it was better to, shall we say, have a chat with the folks in the control tower at the airport, that there were ways to move up your landing slots and get the relief on the ground. Some of the relief on the ground was uncovered in the heat of the day sun and in the rain. And we had our own encounter with the local troops who found it very important that we know how they can load and unload their weapons in front of journalists. It was an interesting place that had suffered one of the great tragedies on earth, and I think this is where it's incumbent on other nations, members of the world community, perhaps the United Nations, to say that when something happens like this, it's the world's problem. And in a sense, it ceases to become a local issue. But thank you, young man, for your question.
Okay, why don't we go here and then we'll come over here to Dr. Hyam, please.
Mr. Williams, there are a lot of people that say that let me begin with some background. In high school, I'm a high school journalist on our newspaper, and we always learn that freedom of speech is guaranteed by the Constitution. However, it lies in the hands of the people who have the money to spread their speech. With the advent of the web, and as you said yourself, the ability for anybody with a laptop and an opinion to spread that opinion, what's your response to the theory put forth, the idea put forth that the internet is going to expand free speech and is going to take it out of the hands of the large, powerful, rich, and some people would claim corrupt networks? If that is what people want, I guess like liquid, it will find its own natural level and market. What I have a problem with
is what I've seen written about people, for that matter, about me, in this new, vast, unregulated land. I know what I go through to put a piece of journalism on the air. In any given newscast, the traps that our writing must go through, the scrubbers that what I write for the newscast must go through to remove biases, any errors of fact. All that's forgiven and forgotten in some reaches of the internet. And I guess we like to hope that this is where, to use a hideous expression, brand names, the media names that people have become used to, when it counts, when they're looking for coverage that they can trust, we hope that that comes into play. I think people realize the difference, but we're still working out what it is. We're still trying to figure out how we feel about it. I may very well be a blogger a few weeks or months from now. I may join in, but when it comes to getting news, because of the way I'm wired and my American experience and who I am, I will probably always still go to the sources I've been familiar with. And I think that natural dynamic happens in a lot of places. I will look into this network corruption you speak of and get back to you on that.
I meant to say bias, I'm sorry.
Brian, Dr. Robin Hyam, one of our historians here. Robin?
I'm afraid I have a rather more smaller question, but I'm curious as to why the media emphasizes every single person who gets killed in Iraq and doesn't point out the many more people who get killed on the highways and in other ways every year.
Well, I think the difference is these are young Americans who raise their hand in a volunteer military and in some cases left their jobs at Home Depot to say, you know what, I'll go over there and I will put on body armor and I will be trained. I will fulfill my commitment to the Guard and Reserve or regular Army, Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps, and I will go fight in this cause. And I will believe my government and my commander-in-chief that this is a truly worthy cause. As I said, having been there, I will automatically respect all who have served there. I think something like highway deaths, while we mourn them and while any death is lamentable, I think we all know by now that we are driving a large motorized missile in some of these cases. Cars can kill. It's as a friend of mine says, driving is a privilege and not a right. We assume that when we get behind the wheel. We have government agencies that, going back to the Great Society, have been set up to make sure that our cars are as safe as they can be. But I think most people draw the distinction between the bravery required to work in theater, to face hostile fire, to leave a comfortable home and life, and go over and wear the uniform of one's country, and then to lose one's life in that fashion.
Well, I think I make one quick response to that is that I was a volunteer in World War II, and we didn't get anything like that kind of coverage. Now, maybe it was because of the size.
Well, that's true. This titanic effort where, first of all, the constraints on reporting made it different. The ubiquitous news media today make it different. The personalized nature of this conflict makes it different. And I think back then, as a lover of history, having probably read many of the same books about that period, it was, what was our entire uniformed force at one point, 16 million? It was absolutely incredible. And so I think it's apples and oranges regarding the context, background, and historic framework for the two conflicts, though allow me to thank you for your service in World War II.
Well, thank you.
You want to take a couple more? Sure. A couple more. Over here? Okay. Let me take a couple more over here.
Yes, sir.
First, I want just tell you how much I appreciate and enjoy your work that you do.
Thank you.
And my question is, what is the most vivid memory of an event you've covered in your life?
Oh, boy. I have a hard time with those because having to weed out and select just one, would you accept a short, non-time-consuming list? Seeing people vote for the first time in South Africa, the election of Nelson Mandela, walking from Berlin into East Germany the first day of the end of the Berlin Wall, going through Checkpoint Charlie one day and going back there the next and looking at those completely irrelevant East Germans and their completely irrelevant German shepherds. Traveling on Air Force One with 3 presidents, having the privilege to cover the President of the United States, being at political conventions, political elections, the horror of 9/11 and what it did to all of us. And those of us from New York still walk around, of course, with a hole in our hearts every day. I will drive tonight past a neighbor's house who lost his life. My hometown is absent 43 people, and I'll look at that yawning gap in the sky just a few hours from now. So there are so many stories. Just the life and death of Pope John Paul II recently. It's why I say to you, you've heard from a lot of great people, as you will continue to, as the great legacy of Alf Landon plays out in this series that bears his name. I don't think you'll ever hear from someone who feels they're as lucky as I am and that they have lived so fully the American experience. I started with an outlandish dream when I first arrived in Kansas, and the state of Kansas has been awfully good to this kid from upstate New York. So thank you.
Thank you.
Whenever you need to wrap up.
A couple more questions here, and Brian's got to get back to New York.
Mr. Williams, I'd also like to thank you as the student in agricultural journalism and communications. I really look up to you and every other news anchor today, including your predecessor, Tom Brokaw. A few weeks ago when Jim Lehrer was here, I asked him this question, and I'm going to ask you the same. Of all of the people you've had the pleasure of interviewing over the years, who has been your most memorable and who's made the biggest impact on your life? I know that day we had former Senator Kassebaum here, and he pointed her out. We don't have her here today, so who would you say would be the most memorable and made the biggest impact on your life?
Another one of those questions. And first, let me say I was in contact with Jim Lehrer yesterday. I had occasion to go out to the Johnson Presidential Library with Lehrer and Schieffer, these 2 Texans. And, you know, all day long they were just reminiscing. Remember that pothole on I-54 as you can... And they are a stitch, and both great men separately, and say nothing of the chemical reaction that happens when they get together. We are a better industry for the fact that we have Jim Lehrer and Bob Schieffer in it. And again, this is a near impossible question to answer. I get as much of a thrill talking to someone I walk up to, someone I meet by chance. I can learn so much wisdom. A portable, crystalline wisdom from someone I meet who's working 7 days a week on his or her farm, or someone who works in a laboratory, or someone who prepares a race car to go out every Sunday, as I can heads of state. The great thing about my life is these people I've been able to meet and get to know. I never dreamed I'd be able to sit down and talk to the likes of Gerald Ford, for all he means to this nation, along with his wife, who single-handedly has removed the stigma of breast cancer and substance abuse. What a great time to live in for the people we talk to. And if I gave you any one name, I'd be doing such an injustice to the 30,000 other interviews I've done. Can I just answer that we live in a great place and that every day affords us a great new opportunity? And thank you for your kindness, by the way.
Okay, just 2 more questions. This one here, and then one here, and then we'll have to...
Mr.
Yes,
Williams, just curious kind of on your views. You know, in recent times it seems that the United Nations has become increasingly issues regarding its question as far as what its purpose is and of course, the scandals involved. Do you think the United Nations has, to some extent, become, for lack of a better term, impotent? And what do you see as its future direction needing to be to reinstate its purpose in the world?
A couple of things, and this is not ducking your question, and I probably should have mentioned this in my remarks. There are a couple things about my profession that are very important to me, and they regulate journalists that do what I do. Number one, I don't accept money to give speeches. Many people do. I don't judge those who do. But I meant to tell you, K-State is so generous, they offer an honorarium for those who deliver this address. And please know that you, as part of the K-State community, are helping a recently paralyzed 17-year-old girl named Emma Verrill, who would like very much to go to college. And now in her wheelchair, it is looking a little more difficult to her. So when you go to bed tonight, please realize that this speech today and my appearance is going to help a freshman year become an attainable goal for a 17-year-old from Portland, Maine. And number two, though I don't judge those who do, I don't do opinions. I don't think it's relevant, germane, important. I don't think people really care that much what I believe. I love when my viewer mail runs exactly 50-50. Aha, we heard you, you're a flame-throwing Republican, and aha, we heard you, you're a flame-throwing Democrat. That means you're doing your job. I do not even share it with members of my family for whom I vote for president, and it drives them all just completely insane. But I want them to have plausible deniability, one of the great expressions from the Watergate era. So I'm going to not take your question, except to commend to the attention of everyone here, go back and read about the founding ideals of the United Nations. The last day Roosevelt was alive, April 12th, 1945, at the little White House in Warm Springs, Georgia. What was he talking about to his friends gathered there? He was so excited about the UN. Eventually, of course, opened by Harry Truman. He would never reach his goal of going to San Francisco for the opening. But perhaps with a lot of institutions that get long in the tooth and have their underpinnings questioned, go back, look at the original charge, the founding documents, and the thoughts behind it. But beyond that, I can't speak to the issue in chief. I apologize for ducking your question.
Okay, one more over here.
What is the biggest piece of advice you could leave us all with in regards to striving towards our personal and professional development and goals and achieving those?
Thank you for the question, and it'll be the perfect way to end. Again, you're looking at a college dropout. I came this close to taking the police exam in the town where I grew up. I was a firefighter. I love my town. I was going to local community college, and then it's as if someone just twisted my head and said, wait a minute, remember that dream you had, that where you wanted to go? If you want to pursue it, you're certainly doing it in the right country. There's a whole system set up for all of you to succeed. They're out there waiting for you. This is the place. So I live by the motto, life's too short, because we've seen way too many people leave all of our lives too soon. But in answer to that question, I would say that the bromide to take away from today, as flattered and overwhelmed as I am to be here, on the shoulders of so many great people. If I can do it, folks, so can anyone within the sound of my voice. Thank you so much for your Kansas hospitality, and God bless.